The alarms had been screaming for 3 days straight across the draconian Imperial flagship. Not the kind that warned of enemy attacks or system failures, but something far worse. The soft, desperate wailing that came from the royal nursery had grown weaker with each passing hour, and Emperor Thaxus felt his ancient heart breaking with every pitiful sound. 3 tiny forms lay motionless in their crystal incubators, each no bigger than a common house pet. These were his heirs, his future, the next generation of dragons that would one day command fleets and burn entire worlds to ash. Now they looked more like dying lizards than the mighty creatures they were destined to become. Their golden and crimson scales had dulled to a sickly gray, and their once bright eyes barely opened when the medical staff approached. Dr. Corvain, the Empire's most celebrated xenobiologist, backed away from the nearest incubator with blood streaming from his nose. The psychic backlash from the weakened dragonlings had nearly shattered his mind. Even in their dying state, the babies possessed devastating mental abilities that lashed out at anyone who came too close. "Your Majesty," Corvain wheezed, struggling to maintain his composure. "I have never encountered anything like this. Their neural patterns are completely chaotic. Every time we attempt to administer treatment, they reject it violently. The psychic feedback is beyond anything in our medical databases." Thaxus growled, a sound that made the thick metal walls of the nursery vibrate. He was over 800 years old, had conquered 12 star systems and commanded the loyalty of trillions of beings across the galaxy. Yet he stood helpless before 3 creatures that weighed less than his smallest claw. The Emperor's personal physician, a brilliant crystalline named Hexar, whose diamond-like body pulsed with nervous energy, approached cautiously. "Majesty, we have tried everything. Bioregeneration chambers, quantum healing matrices, even the ancient feeding rituals from the old homeworld. Nothing works. They refuse all nutrition and attack anyone who gets within range of their psychic field." Through the transparent walls of the incubators, Thaxus could see his children struggling. The smallest one, a female with what had once been brilliant golden scales, barely moved at all. Her brothers were slightly stronger, but not by much. Their tiny chests rose and fell in irregular patterns that spoke of failing systems and fading life force. "Have you consulted the archives?" Thaxus demanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Every record, Majesty," Hexar replied, his crystalline form dimming with exhaustion. "Dragon infancy is poorly documented even in our most secret files. Most noble families raise their young in complete isolation, and the specific care requirements are considered sacred knowledge, passed down only within bloodlines. Your own royal line has been the exception, using the best medical technology available. And that technology is failing them," Thaxus snarled. The truth was more complicated than anyone dared speak aloud. Draconian medicine had advanced far beyond what their ancestors had ever imagined. They could regrow limbs, cure genetic diseases, and extend lifespans by centuries. But somewhere in their technological evolution, they had lost touch with the simpler aspects of caring for their young. The ancient ways were considered primitive, abandoned in favor of sterile medical perfection. News of the crisis had begun to spread despite attempts to contain it. The Emperor's enemies would pounce on any sign of weakness, and what could be weaker than an inability to keep his own heirs alive? Rebellious systems that had been quietly plotting would see this as their opportunity. The stability of the entire Empire depended on those 3 tiny lives in the crystal chambers. "Send word throughout the galaxy," Thaxus commanded suddenly, his decision surprising even himself. "To every world, every system, every species under Imperial rule and beyond. Anyone who can heal my children will be granted a planet of their choosing from my personal territories. Any resources they require, any price they name within reason." The medical staff exchanged glances. This was unprecedented. The Emperor was essentially admitting that his own people could not solve the crisis. "And if they fail?" Hexar asked quietly. Thaxus's eyes burned with barely controlled fury. "If they waste my time with false hopes while my children die, they will face the traditional penalty for disappointing the Imperial throne." Everyone in the room understood. Failure meant death, usually in the most unpleasant way possible. Yet the Emperor was desperate enough to risk bringing outsiders into the most secure location in the Empire. The message would go out within hours, transmitted across faster-than-light communication networks to every inhabited system. Within the incubators, the baby dragons stirred fitfully. Their psychic emanations painted the room with waves of confusion, pain, and primal fear. They were lost in a world of bright lights, strange sounds, and clinical efficiency that their developing minds could not process. Every attempt to help them only added to their terror, which in turn made them more difficult to treat. The irony was cruel. These creatures would someday grow into beings of immense power and intelligence, capable of complex thought and devastating warfare. But right now, they were simply frightened infants who needed something that all the Empire's advanced technology could not provide. They needed understanding, patience, and a kind of care that went beyond medical procedures and healing devices. As the Imperial decree went out across the stars, responses began flooding in almost immediately. Healers, doctors, shamans, and miracle workers from hundreds of species requested transport to the flagship. Some were legitimate medical professionals, seeking the incredible reward. Others were opportunists and charlatans hoping to somehow deceive their way to a free planet. Many were simply beings who genuinely wanted to help, regardless of the personal risk. Among the thousands of responses, one came from a small medical station on the outer rim of human space. It was simple, almost humble, compared to the elaborate proposals from famous healers and renowned medical institutes. The human who sent it claimed no special powers or revolutionary techniques. She simply said she had experience with difficult cases and asked for permission to try. The message was nearly lost among the flood of responses, filed away with hundreds of others from species the Empire considered primitive or irrelevant. But something about its simplicity caught the attention of Thaxus's personal aide, who flagged it for review. Perhaps desperation was making them consider options they would normally dismiss without a second thought. The message arrived at Station Haven during the night shift, when most of the medical staff were catching what sleep they could between emergencies. Dr. Emma Rivers had been awake for 36 hours straight, helping deliver twins to a Centauri couple whose ship had broken down in the middle of nowhere. She was finally settling down with a cup of coffee when the priority communication alert chimed through the station's speakers. "Emma, you need to see this," called Tom Bradley, the communications officer, his voice tight with disbelief. "It's from the Draconian Empire. They're asking for medical volunteers." Emma nearly dropped her coffee. The Draconian Empire was legendary throughout human space, but not in a good way. They were the kind of civilization that most humans hoped never to encounter. Powerful beyond imagination, ruthless in their expansion, and utterly convinced of their own superiority. The fact that they were asking anyone for help, much less humans, was almost unthinkable. She read the message twice before the full meaning sank in. The Emperor's children were dying, and every medical expert in the Empire had failed to save them. The reward being offered was staggering, but so was the risk. The decree made it clear that failure would result in execution. "You're not seriously considering this," said Dr. Martinez, the station's chief medical officer, when Emma mentioned it during the morning briefing. "These are dragons we're talking about. Even as babies, they could probably kill you with a thought." "They're children," Emma replied simply. "Sick children who need help." The rest of the medical staff looked at her as if she had lost her mind. Station Haven served the Outer Rim territories, dealing mostly with miners, traders, and colonists who couldn't afford the fancy medical facilities in the core systems. They saw everything from radiation poisoning to exotic diseases picked up on unexplored worlds. But this was different. This was walking into the heart of an empire that could destroy Earth without breaking stride. Emma had always been different from her colleagues. While other doctors focused on the technical aspects of medicine, she seemed to understand something deeper about healing. She had a gift for connecting with patients, especially the difficult ones. The traumatized refugee children who wouldn't speak to anyone else would whisper their fears to her. The alien species that other humans found disturbing or frightening seemed to trust her instinctively. Over the next few days, she researched everything she could find about draconian physiology. The information was frustratingly limited. Dragons were secretive about their biology, and their early development stages were considered state secrets. What little she could find suggested that dragon infants were incredibly sensitive to their environment, with psychic abilities that developed long before their physical coordination. "I think I understand what might be happening," she told Dr. Martinez during one of their discussions. "If these babies are as psychically sensitive as the reports suggest, they might be overwhelmed by all the medical attention they're receiving. Every procedure, every test, every attempt to help them could be making things worse." "That's a pretty big assumption to bet your life on," Martinez replied. Emma knew he was right. She was asking to travel halfway across the galaxy based on a theory about creatures she had never seen, to treat conditions she didn't fully understand with the knowledge that failure meant certain death. Any rational person would stay safely on Station Haven and continue their quiet work on the Rim. But Emma kept thinking about the message's description of the dying dragonlings, the way it described their weakness, their fear, their rejection of help. It reminded her of the most difficult cases she had handled. Children who had been so traumatized or overwhelmed that they couldn't accept care from anyone. Sometimes the solution wasn't more medicine or better technology. Sometimes it was just patience, understanding, and the willingness to approach them differently. The decision, when she finally made it, surprised even herself. She submitted her volunteer application with a simple message: "I have experience with difficult pediatric cases and would like to help." The response came back within hours. The Empire was arranging transport immediately. She had 72 hours to prepare for a journey that would take her further from human space than any civilian had ever traveled. Her colleagues thought she was committing elaborate suicide. Her family, when she managed to contact them, begged her to reconsider. But Emma felt something she couldn't quite explain, a certainty that this was what she was meant to do. She packed light, bringing only the most basic medical supplies and a few personal items that had always brought her comfort. The Imperial transport that picked her up was unlike anything in the human fleet. It was massive, elegant, and clearly built by a civilization that viewed space travel as an art form rather than just a means of transportation. The crew were professional but distant, treating her with the kind of polite respect usually reserved for someone attending their own funeral. During the weeks-long journey to the Imperial capital, Emma had time to think about what she was walking into. She studied the limited information about dragon psychology and physiology until she could recite it from memory. She practiced meditation techniques that might help her stay calm under psychic assault. Most importantly, she tried to prepare herself mentally for the possibility that she might die far from home, alone among aliens who saw her as nothing more than another failed experiment. The other passengers on the transport were a mix of species, all volunteers responding to the Emperor's call. There was a famous Andromedan healer whose reputation spanned multiple galaxies, a team of vegan bioengineers with experimental technology, and several others whose credentials made Emma feel completely out of her depth. They began to disappear as the ship neared the capital, transported down to the surface for their attempts to save the Imperial heirs. None returned to the ship. Emma tried not to think about what that meant. When her turn finally came, she stood in the transport chamber wearing her simple medical uniform, carrying a basic medical kit and a small stuffed animal she had brought from Earth. Compared to the elaborate equipment and ceremonial robes of the previous volunteers, she looked more like a lost child than a miracle worker. The Imperial guards who escorted her from the transport pad were enormous, their scaled faces unreadable behind ceremonial masks. They led her through corridors that spoke of wealth and power beyond human imagination, past halls lined with trophies from conquered worlds and artifacts that represented the accumulated knowledge of dozens of civilizations. As they walked, Emma began to hear it, a sound that made her heart ache with recognition. Somewhere ahead, children were crying. Not the angry roars she had expected from dragon infants, but the weak, desperate wails of babies who were sick, frightened, and desperately in need of comfort. The nursery doors were made of some dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Emma could feel the psychic distress radiating from beyond them, like heat from a furnace. The Imperial guards who had escorted her this far now stood at a respectful distance, their body language making it clear they had no intention of going any further. Emperor Thaxus waited in the observation chamber, his massive form hunched over monitors that displayed the vital signs of his dying. Children. He was nothing like Emma had imagined. Where she had expected a monster, she saw a father consumed by grief and desperation. His golden eyes, each larger than Emma's entire head, tracked every fluctuation in the medical readouts with the intensity of someone watching life itself slip away. "You are the human," he said, his voice a low rumble that made the floor vibrate beneath Emma's feet. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Your Majesty, Dr. Emma Rivers." Thaxus studied her with obvious disappointment. She could practically see him wondering how this small, unremarkable being could succeed where his greatest minds had failed. The Emperor's personal physicians stood nearby, their faces showing mixtures of exhaustion, frustration, and barely concealed contempt for yet another hopeless attempt. The previous volunteer lasted less than 10 minutes, Dr. Corvain informed her, gesturing toward the sealed doors. The psychic feedback left him catatonic. We had to sedate him just to stop the screaming. Through the observation windows, Emma could see the 3 incubators arranged in the center of the sterile chamber. The baby dragons inside were barely moving, their once magnificent scales now dull and lifeless. But even from this distance, she could feel the waves of terror and confusion emanating from them. "Tell me exactly what happens when someone enters," Emma said, surprising the medical staff with her calm tone. "Immediate psychic assault," Hexar replied, his crystalline form pulsing with nervous energy. "The infants' minds are chaotic, broadcasting raw emotion and pain. Anyone who approaches becomes overwhelmed by their distress, which only makes them more agitated. It's a feedback loop that becomes more intense with each attempt." Emma nodded, watching the babies through the thick glass. She had seen similar patterns before, though never on this scale. Traumatized children who had been through so much medical intervention that they associated any caregiver with more pain and fear. The difference was that these children could project their terror directly into the minds of anyone trying to help them. "What's the normal procedure when you enter?" she asked. "Full medical protocols," Corvain explained. "Sterilization fields, diagnostic scanners, automated feeding systems. We approach with all necessary equipment to minimize the time spent in direct contact. And lighting? Maximum illumination for optimal medical observation." Emma closed her eyes, trying to imagine what that experience must be like for creatures whose senses were far more acute than any humans. Bright lights, strange sounds, cold medical equipment, and beings whose emotions were focused entirely on clinical efficiency rather than comfort or care. "I need to try a different approach," she said. The Emperor's laugh was bitter. "Another approach? We have tried everything. Ancient remedies, modern technology, mystical healing arts from a dozen worlds. What could you possibly do that we have not already attempted?" "I want to sit with them," Emma said simply. "No equipment, no procedures, no attempts at treatment, just presence." The medical staff exchanged glances that clearly said they thought she was insane. Dr. Corvain stepped forward, his expression serious. "Dr. Rivers, I appreciate your confidence, but you don't understand what you're facing. The psychic assault is not something you can simply endure through willpower. It will shatter your mind." "Maybe," Emma agreed. "But I'd like to try." Emperor Thaxus was quiet for a long moment, studying this strange human who seemed so certain, despite having no knowledge of dragon physiology or psychic defenses. Finally he nodded. "What do you require?" "Dim lighting, soft materials like blankets or cushions, and permission to enter alone. No observers, no monitoring beyond basic life signs, and no interruptions unless I specifically ask for help." "This is highly irregular," Hexar protested. "Medical protocol requires constant monitoring, especially given the risks involved." "Your medical protocol is what's terrifying them," Emma replied gently. "They're babies. Sick, frightened babies, who don't understand why everyone who comes near them is afraid or clinical, or trying to force treatments on them. They need someone who isn't afraid of them and isn't trying to fix them." The Emperor considered this. It went against every instinct he had about proper medical care. But then again, proper medical care had failed completely. "Very well," You will have what you request." The preparations took an hour. The harsh medical lighting was replaced with soft, warm illumination that barely reached the corners of the chamber. Thick blankets were brought in, along with cushions that Emma could use to make herself comfortable. The medical monitoring equipment was reduced to the absolute minimum needed to track the baby's vital signs. As Emma prepared to enter, she could feel the skeptical eyes of the imperial court upon her. Word had spread throughout the palace that another volunteer was about to attempt the impossible, and many had gathered to witness what they expected to be yet another failure. Some were hoping for success, but most seemed to be waiting for the entertainment value of watching the presumptuous human get what she deserved. "Are you certain about this?" Emperor Thaxus asked one final time. Emma looked through the observation window at the three tiny forms in their crystal chambers. They looked so small, so helpless, so much like any other sick children she had cared for throughout her career. The only difference was that these children had the ability to defend themselves in ways that made conventional medicine impossible. "I'm certain," she said, and stepped toward the sealed doors. The moment the chamber doors opened, the psychic assault hit her like a physical blow. Waves of pain, terror, and confusion crashed into her mind with an intensity that brought tears to her eyes. But instead of the focused, malicious attack she had expected, Emma felt something else underneath the chaos. Loneliness. Desperate, aching loneliness from three small beings who had been surrounded by people trying to help them, but had never felt truly cared for. She entered the chamber slowly, keeping her movements gentle and deliberate. The psychic pressure increased with each step, but Emma had dealt with overwhelming situations before. She used the breathing techniques she had learned during her training, focusing on staying calm and present rather than trying to fight the mental assault. Instead of approaching the incubators immediately, Emma sat down on one of the soft cushions she had requested, about 10 feet away from the nearest baby dragon. She made no attempt to examine them, reach for them, or even look directly at them. Instead, she simply sat quietly and began to hum a lullaby her grandmother had sung to her when she was small. The lullaby filled the chamber with something that had been missing for weeks: gentleness. Emma's voice was soft and steady, carrying none of the clinical tension or desperate urgency that had characterized every previous interaction with the baby dragons. She sang about starlight and safe harbors, about peaceful sleep and tomorrow's sunshine. The words were in English, meaningless to the dragonlings, but the emotion behind them was universal. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the psychic assault began to change. The sharp spikes of terror and pain remained, but they were no longer focused entirely on driving away the intruder. Confusion crept in, as if the babies were trying to understand this strange new presence that felt different from all the others. Emma continued humming, occasionally switching to different lullabies she remembered from her childhood or had learned while caring for young patients from various cultures. She kept her eyes soft, not staring directly at any of the dragonlings, but maintaining a gentle awareness of their presence. Her breathing stayed slow and even, and most importantly, her emotions remained calm and genuinely caring. Through the observation windows, Emperor Thaxus watched in amazement. The medical monitors showed something unprecedented. The baby's stress hormones were actually beginning to decrease. Their heart rates, which had been erratic and weak for days, were starting to stabilize into more normal patterns. "How is this possible?" Dr. Corvain whispered, staring at the readings in disbelief. After an hour of simply sitting and singing, Emma noticed that the smallest dragonling, the female with golden scales, had turned her head slightly in Emma's direction. It was the first purposeful movement any of them had made in days that wasn't related to rejecting medical care. Emma shifted position slightly, moving a few inches closer while maintaining her gentle demeanor. The psychic pressure increased momentarily, but then settled back to its previous level. The babies were testing her, trying to understand her intentions. "That's right," Emma murmured softly. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm just here to sit with you." By the end of the second hour, something remarkable happened. The golden female managed to lift her head and look directly at Emma. Her eyes, which had been dull and lifeless, showed a spark of curiosity. For the first time since falling ill, she seemed to be truly seeing something in her environment rather than just reacting to threats. Emma smiled and began talking to her, in the same gentle tone she used with all her young patients. "Hello, beautiful. Are you feeling a little better? I know you've been sick, I know you're scared, but you're going to be okay." The other two dragonlings, both males with scales that shifted between red and bronze, began showing signs of awareness as well. They were still weak, still broadcasting waves of discomfort and fear, but the raw panic was diminishing. On the third hour, Emma made her first physical move toward the incubators. She rose slowly from her cushion and approached the golden female's chamber, moving with deliberate care to avoid any sudden motions that might trigger another wave of psychic defense. "May I come closer?" she asked aloud, speaking to the baby dragon as if she were a human child who could understand every word. "I'd like to help you feel better, but only if that's okay with you." The response was immediate and intense. The psychic field around the incubator flared with renewed fear and anger. But underneath the defensive reaction, Emma sensed something else, a desperate longing for comfort that the baby was afraid to express. Emma stopped moving and sat down next to the incubator, close enough to touch it but making no attempt to do so. Instead, she began talking about her own experiences caring for frightened children, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years learning to comfort the inconsolable. "I once took care of a little boy who had been in an accident," she said softly. "He was so scared of doctors that he would hide under his bed whenever someone in medical clothing came into the room. It took 3 weeks before he would let me check his temperature. But do you know what finally helped him? I brought him a stuffed animal that belonged to me when I was little. Something that wasn't medical, wasn't clinical, just soft and comfortable and safe." As she spoke, Emma slowly reached into her small bag and pulled out the stuffed animal she had brought from Earth. It was a small, well-worn bear that had comforted her through childhood nightmares and later provided solace to dozens of young patients who needed something gentle to hold on to. The reaction was immediate. All 3 dragonlings turned toward the stuffed animal with an intensity that made the psychic field in the room shift dramatically. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with curiosity and something that felt almost like hope. "Would you like to see him?" Emma asked, holding the bear where the golden female could see it clearly. "His name is Patches. He's very old and very soft, and he's helped a lot of sick children feel better." Carefully, slowly, Emma placed the stuffed animal against the outside of the incubator. The golden female's psychic emanations shifted again, and then something miraculous happened. Instead of lashing out with defensive mental energy, she pressed herself against the wall of her chamber, trying to get as close as possible to the soft, non-threatening object. Emma's heart nearly broke at the gesture. This tiny creature who possessed the potential to become one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy was desperately seeking the same basic comfort that any frightened child would want. "Oh, sweetheart," Emma whispered, tears running down her cheeks. "You just want someone to make you feel safe, don't you?" Working with infinite patience, Emma began the delicate process of opening the incubator. The medical staff had designed the chambers to be completely secure, but they also included manual overrides for emergency situations. As the seal broke, the psychic field in the room intensified dramatically, but Emma pressed forward. The moment her hand entered the incubator, the golden female's defenses crashed into her mind like a tsunami of raw emotion. But Emma had been preparing for this moment for hours, building a connection based on trust and patience rather than medical necessity. Instead of being overwhelmed, she was able to maintain her calm center. "I know, baby," she murmured, reaching slowly toward the tiny dragon. "I know you're scared, but I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." When her fingers finally made contact with the golden scales, everything changed. The psychic assault stopped abruptly, replaced by something Emma had never experienced before, a direct emotional connection with another being. She could feel the dragonling's relief, her desperate gratitude, and underneath it all, a profound loneliness that finally had hope of ending. The baby dragon, who weighed no more than a house cat, pressed herself against Emma's palm with a soft sound that was part purr, part sigh. For the first time in days, she wasn't afraid. Through the observation windows, Emperor Thaxus watched, in stunned silence as his dying heir began to show signs of real recovery. The medical monitors registered improvements that had seemed impossible just hours before. Heart rate stabilizing, brain activity normalizing, stress hormones dropping to healthy levels. But more important than any medical reading was the simple fact that his daughter was no longer alone in her suffering. She had found someone who understood that healing required more than technology and medicine. Sometimes it required nothing more complicated than the willingness to sit with a frightened child and show them that they were not alone. 3 weeks later, the Imperial Nursery had been transformed into something that looked more like a comfortable living space than a medical facility. Soft blankets covered the floor, warm lighting created a peaceful atmosphere, and the constant hum of medical equipment had been replaced by the gentle sounds of healthy baby dragons at play. Emma sat cross-legged on a large cushion, with all 3 dragonlings curled up around her like oversized cats. The golden female, whom Emma had named Luna because of her love for nighttime feeding sessions, was the most attached. She rarely left Emma's side and had developed a habit of wrapping her tiny tail around Emma's wrist whenever she sensed any anxiety. The 2 males had recovered just as completely. Phoenix, whose scales shifted to brilliant red when he was happy, had an adventurous spirit and was already trying to fly despite wings that wouldn't fully develop for months. Storm, the largest of the 3, was more cautious but showed remarkable intelligence, often seeming to understand Emma's words even before she finished speaking. Emperor Thaxus visited the nursery every day, though he now entered quietly and sat at a respectful distance. The first time he had tried to approach his children directly after their recovery, they had become agitated, not from fear, but from overstimulation. Emma had gently explained that they needed to adjust to him gradually, the same way they had adjusted to her. "They know you love them," Emma had told the Emperor during one of these visits. "But they're still very young, and their psychic abilities make them sensitive to strong emotions. Your love is so intense that it overwhelms them. We need to help them learn to handle it in small doses." It was a humbling experience for a being who commanded the loyalty of trillions, but Thaxus had proven surprisingly adaptable. He learned to moderate his emotions when visiting the nursery, to speak softly, and to let his children come to him rather than trying to force interactions. The breakthrough came during the 4th week, when Luna finally felt comfortable enough to approach her father while Emma was present. The tiny dragon climbed onto Thaxus's massive claw and curled up there as naturally as if it were the most normal thing in the galaxy. The Emperor's joy was so overwhelming that both Phoenix and Storm immediately rushed over, wanting to share in the positive emotions. "I have never seen anything like this," Dr. Corvain admitted to Emma as they watched the family reunion through the observation window. "In all my years of studying dragon physiology, I never imagined that the solution could be so simple." "It's not simple at all," Emma replied. "It's probably the most complex thing in the universe. It's just not complicated." The distinction was important, though Emma wasn't sure the draconian physician fully understood it. The medical techniques required to keep the dragonlings alive had been incredibly sophisticated, involving technology that was beyond anything humans had yet developed. But the emotional care they needed was ancient and universal, requiring nothing more advanced than patience, empathy, and the willingness to put someone else's needs above your own comfort. As word of the miraculous recovery spread throughout the Empire, Emma found herself at the center of attention she had never wanted. Reporters from across the galaxy requested interviews. Medical institutions offered enormous sums for her to share her techniques, and politicians from dozens of worlds wanted to discuss the implications of a human succeeding where the Empire's best minds had failed. Emma declined all of these requests. She had work to do in the nursery, and more importantly, she was beginning to understand that this situation was about much more than 3 sick babies. Emperor Thaxus had reached the same conclusion. He summoned Emma to his private chambers one evening, after the dragonlings had been settled for the night with their collection of soft toys and blankets that had replaced the sterile medical equipment. "Dr. Rivers," he began, his voice carrying a weight of consideration that hadn't been there when they first met. I have been thinking about what you have accomplished here, and I believe I understand something now that I did not before. Emma waited quietly, sensing that the Emperor was working through thoughts that would reshape his understanding of his own empire. You succeeded not because you possessed superior technology or greater knowledge of dragon physiology, Thaxis continued. You succeeded because you approached my children as individuals deserving of care rather than problems to be solved. This distinction has profound implications. The Emperor rose from his throne and moved to a large window that looked out over the capital city, with its gleaming spires and technological marvels that represented the accumulated achievements of the draconian civilization. We have built an empire based on strength, efficiency, and technological superiority, he said. We have conquered systems, assimilated cultures, and imposed our will across the galaxy. But in all of our advancement, we seem to have lost touch with something fundamental about the nature of care itself. Emma joined him at the window, looking out over a city that housed billions of beings from hundreds of different species, all living under draconian rule. Your people, Thaxis said, possess something that we have overlooked in our calculations of galactic power. You understand instinctively how to care for others in ways that transcend species, culture, and biology. This is not a minor skill. It is a form of intelligence that my empire desperately needs. The Emperor turned to face Emma directly, his ancient eyes reflecting a decision that had been forming over the past weeks. I am prepared to offer your species something unprecedented, he said. Not conquest, not subjugation, but partnership. I want to establish human-run medical and care facilities throughout Imperial space, staffed by volunteers from your people who understand what you have demonstrated here. Emma felt the weight of the moment. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. The Emperor was essentially offering humanity a place in his empire based not on military strength or technological advancement, but on their capacity for empathy and care. There would be conditions, she said carefully. Name them. Human independence must be maintained. Our facilities serve all species equally, regardless of their political status or relationship with the Empire. And no human can be forced into this service. It has to be voluntary, because the moment you try to compel this kind of care, it stops being genuine. Emperor Thaxis considered these terms. They went against many of the fundamental principles upon which his empire was built. The draconian way was to impose order through strength and hierarchy. What Emma was proposing was almost the opposite, a network of caregivers who operated based on compassion rather than command. Agreed, he said finally. But I have conditions of my own. These facilities will operate under Imperial protection. Any threat to human medical personnel will be considered an attack on the Empire itself. And I want human advisors involved in the development of our own medical training programs. Not to replace our methods, but to supplement them with this understanding you have demonstrated. Emma felt a mix of excitement and responsibility that was almost overwhelming. This wasn't just about her anymore, or even about the 3 baby dragons sleeping peacefully in the nursery. This was about fundamentally changing how 2 very different civilizations interacted with each other. I'll need to return to human space to discuss this with our leadership, she said. This isn't a decision I can make alone. Of course, but first, I have something to show you. The Emperor led her through corridors she had never seen before, deeper into the palace than she had imagined possible. They arrived at a vast chamber filled with historical artifacts and records from across the Empire's long history. These are the chronicles of our expansion, Thaxis explained, gesturing toward displays that showed the conquest of world after world. Every victory, every assimilation, every species that has been brought under Imperial rule. For 800 years this has been the story of draconian civilization. He moved to a newer section, where displays showed more recent additions to the Empire. But look at these worlds, the ones we conquered in the last century. Notice anything different about them? Emma studied the displays carefully. After a moment, she realized what he was pointing out. They're not thriving the way the older territories are. Exactly. The longer we rely purely on technological superiority and military strength, the less successful our integration becomes. We can conquer worlds, but we struggle to truly integrate their populations. There's something missing from our approach, something that prevents genuine loyalty and cooperation. The Emperor moved to a final display, this one showing demographic data from across the Empire. Birth rates are declining on many worlds. Mental health issues are increasing. Despite our advanced technology, many of our subject populations seem to be losing the will to thrive. We attributed this to the natural challenges of managing a diverse empire, but now I wonder if we were missing something more fundamental. Emma began to understand the full scope of what he was proposing. This wasn't just about medical facilities or even about caring for the sick. It was about fundamentally changing how the Empire related to the beings under its rule. "You think humans could help with more than just medical care?" she said. "I think humans understand something about nurturing life and building genuine community that we have forgotten, if we ever knew it at all. Your success with my children was not just medical. It was about creating an environment where they could feel safe enough to heal themselves." The implications were staggering. Emma thought about human colonies scattered throughout the outer rim. Small communities that somehow managed to thrive despite limited resources and constant challenges. They succeeded not because of superior technology, but because of their ability to support each other, to create environments where individuals could flourish. "There's something else," the Emperor said, his voice taking on a tone Emma had never heard from him before. Something almost vulnerable. "My children are not just heirs to the throne. They are the first generation of dragons to be born with enhanced psychic abilities. Their mental capabilities will far exceed anything our species has seen before. But with that power comes sensitivity, complexity, and needs that our traditional methods cannot address." Emma understood. The baby dragons weren't just individual cases. They represented the future of the draconian species. And that future would require a completely different approach to development and care. They will need guides who understand how to nurture exceptional abilities without overwhelming the individuals who possess them, Thaxis continued. Teachers who can help them integrate their power with wisdom and compassion, rather than just strength and dominance. "You want humans to help raise the next generation of imperial leadership," Emma realized. "I want humans to help us learn how to raise them properly. The old ways will not serve children whose minds can touch the thoughts of others across star systems. They need to learn not just how to use their power, but how to exist in the universe without being consumed by it." Emma looked back toward the nursery where 3 tiny dragons were sleeping peacefully, surrounded by stuffed animals and soft blankets. In a few decades, they would be among the most powerful beings in the galaxy. The idea that their early experiences with human caregivers might shape how they use that power was both thrilling and terrifying. "I'll need time to think about this," she said finally. "Of course. But I want you to know that regardless of what your people decide about the larger proposal, you have earned something that no outsider has ever received from the Draconian Empire." "What's that?" "Trust and gratitude that extends beyond any reward I could offer. You saved not just my children's lives, but their capacity for joy, for connection, for the kind of happiness that makes power worth having." As Emma returned to the nursery for one final night with her tiny patients, she realized that this was bigger than anything humanity had ever encountered. They were being offered a chance to help shape the future of galactic civilization, not through conquest or technology, but through the simple, profound act of caring for others. The baby dragons stirred as she entered, sensing her presence even in their sleep. Luna opened one eye and made a soft sound of contentment when she saw Emma settling into her usual sleeping spot nearby. In a few days, Emma would board a ship for the long journey back to human space, carrying news that would change everything. But tonight she was simply a nurse sitting with 3 children who needed her, doing what humans had always done best, making sure that no one had to face the darkness alone.